Today we're going to be covering the topic of imperialism. You should have a set of notes that looks like this. There's going to be some like boxes and questions that you need to fill out, a little bit of analysis of a couple sources and pictures. So be aware that there is some, I guess, more work than just, copying out your usual, little words and stuff. So we're going to be discussing this thing called the Age of Imperialism. And hopefully you've finished up the Strayer chapter that covers this issue. It did a really nice job of outlining the big issues that are involved here. If you are using the Boulier textbook, then I think the equivalent chapter was 27. And both of those chapters do a really nice job of kind of giving you that broad overview and looking at the effect that imperialism had on both Asia and Africa. And today in this lecture, we're going to focus on the big ideas of this new type of imperialism, and then we're going to zero in a little bit on Africa, mostly the sub-Saharan portion of Africa. So, the Age of Imperialism, I think, in many ways is best defined by the voices who actually participated in it. Cecil Rhodes is one of those. He was actually a sort of fortune hunter. He founded Rhodesia, which was a colony in the southern portion of Africa, and he definitely was an unsavory character. He was very interested in like get-rich-quick sorts of schemes, and he definitely had some of the most sort of exemplary quotes of the imperialist era. He is exceedingly racist and pretty much says what he really believes. And I think that many of his quotes really exemplify the kind of attitude that Europeans had when they went out and created these empires during the second half of the 1800s. And, well, if you would, just take a look at his quote and take a moment to fill in that very top box. And when he says Anglo-Saxon here, he's pretty much just referring to English people. And I hope that you can see there's nothing subtle about this. He basically says that taking over more land means more of the best sort of people. So it's really, really straightforward. All right. We're going to look from the period of about 1880 to 1914, give or take. We'll be backing it up just a little bit, I think, before 1880, so that you can sort of see how things develop. But that will be sort of the height of the imperialist era. All right, now we've got a second bit of analysis that we need to do, and let's go ahead and take a look at this cartoon. This cartoon was actually in the Strayer text. It gave you a little bit of background about it. It is actually an American cartoon, sort of depicting the British. The date on the cartoon is 1882, and you can see that Britain is getting ready to make a grab right there for Egypt. And I want to point out something really important on this cartoon. Right here, it has the word canal, and that's not just any canal. That's referring to the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is still vitally important to worldwide shipping, and Britain really was interested in gaining and holding the Suez Canal for itself. And a couple weeks ago, or maybe it was, no, actually, I'm sorry, it was a couple weeks ago, we talked about Muhammad Ali in Egypt and his attempts to modernize and meet the European challenge that his nation was facing in being overwhelmed by the newly industrialized power of nations like England. And they ended up failing in that endeavor and became pretty much a protectorate of England, as England was able to use their military power to sort of push Egypt around and actually did gain control of the Suez Canal. And this is not a favorable picture of imperialism, I don't think. Obviously, the American who created this cartoon is not just skeptical of imperialism, but critical of the idea that Britain is going out and like taking over all of these areas for itself. Of course, it starts close at home here. The octopus of England is holding Ireland, which we actually discussed a little bit earlier, just a few weeks ago, how England went out and exploited Ireland for its own personal gain as well. All right. Let's start with just a simple definition. Imperialism is one country's domination of political, economic, and social life of another country. And it is in no way, shape, or form a sort of benign concept. Benign means not harmful, okay? To be imperialized is to explicitly be exploited by another country. That is the only reason to go out and imperialize another country, is if your goal is to exploit it. And so I want you all to bear that in mind throughout this whole unit as we talk about imperialism. There are going to be justifications that attempt to sort of pretend that imperialism is for the good of the people who are being imperialized, but that is never the case. That's sort of a ruse to cover up the exploitation that's actually going to be occurring when another country is imperialized. And Strayer at least did a really nice job of outlining what was different about this new sort of imperialism that began in the mid-1800s. And there have been a ton of empires. We've studied empires since almost the beginning of this year. We always know, an empire is kind of like a leech. It goes out and it takes the resources of the area that it's taking over. But in this case, the imperialism is something a little bit new and a little bit more invasive. Strayer referred to it as the second wave of European conquest. And he noted a number of differences. One of the most important ones, I think, is the ability of Europeans to actually have a direct impact on the people that they were ruling because of industrialization. So they had almost a day-to-day impact on the interior of the lands that they had conquered in a way that most empires in the past had not been able to exert. They always attempted to centralize, but without those really important inventions, for example, trains and telegraph wires. It's very difficult to have that level of centralization that Europeans were able to achieve with these new empires. And with that increased centralization, of course, comes an increased ability to extract resources and to tax the people who they were imperializing. All right. We're going to talk about main motives of imperialism just as a way to remember why Europeans were actually going out and doing this. Strayer was very explicit about this, as was the bullet textbook. Markets. Markets is a huge thing. They both need to import raw materials back to the mother country, and they need to export the finished product back to their colonies. Industrialization is fed on the back of raw materials, and economic stability as well as growth really hinges on the ability of more and more people to purchase these mass-produced objects. So both of those markets are a huge driving force behind this new type of imperialism. So A, just to be very explicit again, is to acquire resources. In many ways, again, imperialism was about exploitation, but at a greater level than what we had seen in the past. Here's the sort of cultural component of this new imperialism. The goal was to introduce Christianity and European culture, which Europeans viewed as sort of inherently superior. Strayer noted at several points in the chapter the way that Europeans attempted to um, attribute what they viewed as sort of negative qualities to the cultures that they were imperializing. So this is a very chauvinistic time period, and they often attributed feminine characteristics to the people that they were colonizing, or childlike characteristics to the people that they were colonizing, in order to sort of infantilize the people who they wanted to take over, to sort of pretend that it was for their own good, that they needed sort of someone to come in and um, sort of lead them to a better culture, a better life. So that is a huge component of imperialism and nationalism. This is huge. Competition between nations, especially in Africa, is going to be important. So I'd like you to note out to the side, especially in Africa. Nationalism is going to result in a huge desire to gain colonies. And what you'll notice, I hope you noticed, Strayer had a great map that he presented of various uh, rebellions, pretty much, and they were really constant throughout Africa. In through the 1920s, he actually had a quote from a British soldier who was involved in conquering areas of Africa. And the quote that he gave noted that it was pitiful to see a village being knocked over and to be destroyed, but and he wished that there was a different way to go about subduing these areas and making them colonies. But of course, he notes that there isn't, because of course, if you're going to move in with superior weaponry to take over someone's country, in most cases they're going to resist you. And despite the fact that it was extremely difficult to create these empires, and in a very literal way created continuous wars, Europeans were still driven by that idea that having colonies sort of proved their worth as a nation. And for example, Britain, which had the most colonies, would never want to fall behind France um, in having, too few colonies. Or nations who were recently formed, for example, Germany, which we just covered in class, which just became a nation in 1870. It wanted to sort of prove that it was valuable and important on the world stage by going out and expressing its nationalism by taking over other countries. So even though it was exceedingly difficult and produced endless wars, rebellions, and a need for huge military presence in these areas and a constant drain, I mean, none of these colonies was profitable for Europeans, but even though they were not profitable, Europeans still felt that almost ridiculous urge to go out and conquer these other nations. So, why do Europeans feel not only that they should go out and conquer through nationalism, but why do they feel that they could? A lot of that, of course, has to do with industrialization, the pure fact of having the weapons. There was that great quote about the Maxim gun, and it was just a little short couplet poem. Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not. And that Maxim gun is a reference to the first machine gun, which was actually invented in the 1880s. So there is this fact of overwhelming military force that Europeans are able to go out, but they also felt this new bond to what I'll refer to as pseudoscience. They felt racially superior to other people, and that made them feel that they could conquer. So not only did they have the industrial power and new weaponry to be able to conquer, not only did they have nationalism behind them, this huge motive to go and conquer, they also had a sort of pseudoscience racist superiority complex. Now, this technically stems out of Darwin. Strayer rightly noted that it was a sort of misapplication of Darwin's theory. Of course, humans do not live in a state of nature, right? So natural selection in the sense that Darwin described it in the natural world doesn't exist in in human society. So the idea that humans have sort of evolved into a hierarchy of races is inherently flawed, and it's not related directly to Darwin's theory of natural selection. However, Herbert Spencer, the creator of the idea of social Darwinism, and I'd like you to put a star both beside social Darwinism and beside Herbert Spencer's name. His ideas really caught on, and he's actually the person who coined the term evolution. The term evolution doesn't appear in Darwin's On the Origin of Species, where he proposes the idea of natural selection, I think until something like the 8th or ninth edition of Darwin's book. Herbert Spencer is actually the person who coined that term, and he uses it to describe sort of variations of human races. Of course, it's not backed by any real science, but Europeans thought that this was like the coolest idea ever because it put white European males at the sort of pinnacle of all, you know, animal and human development ever of all time. So who wouldn't like that if that was the description that you were hearing about yourself? Social Darwinism is a huge draw for Europeans and a huge method of justifying the actions that Europeans were taking in both Asia and Africa. The greatest sort of example of the paternalistic use of social Darwinism is in Rudyard Kipling's famous poem called The White Man's Burden, and we'll actually read this in class upcoming. And when I say paternalistic, I mean it from the root of father, right? So paternalistic means father-like, right? So the idea that you're being caring or helpful to someone. The term paternalistic isn't necessarily a positive one. It sort of assumes that you are creating a child out of a group of people that are grown-ups. So it's like a slap in the face to those people or insulting to those people. But the poem White Man's Burden makes imperialism seem like it's a nice thing to do. Like white Europeans would go to places like Africa where people were he actually calls them half devil and half child, and they would help to create a civilized population in that area. And this was hugely popular in Europe as a way to describe and justify what was actually being done, which of course was to exploit and take resources from those areas. All right, we've got several forms of imperialism that we need to discuss, and there's a arrow that moves down right here. That is because these are going from most invasive down to least invasive here at the bottom. And I want you to put a big fat llama right beside this point because this will appear almost verbatim on your time period 5 exam. We need to know these various forms of imperialistic rule, and we need to know which one is the most invasive and which one is the least invasive. First, you've got a colony, which is when a area is ruled directly by an imperial power. There's also sort of a slightly lesser version of imperialism, which is called a protectorate. This is where a native government is guided by a foreign power. Egypt fell into that category. So technically, your local rulers are still in power, but in fact, a European nation is sort of pulling the strings. And then there's the sphere of influence. China falls into this category. So if you'd like to jot China out beside sphere of influence, this is where an imperial power has exclusive economic rights. A number of various powers had power in China after the Opium Wars. Of course, Britain, who forced China to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, but also Japan, Russia. Let's see, my brain is blanking a little bit. Japan, also France. So various areas had spheres of influence within China. For protectorate, remember your example is Egypt, and then a full-fledged colony, South Africa would fall under this category, Kenya, Ghana, any of those areas. This is actually a little cartoon of Otto von Bismarck, if you'll remember him from German nationalism. He's trying to go out and get some colonies right there with his scary dog. All right. So, it is important to remember that elites in both Europe and oftentimes in the colony itself could benefit from imperialism. As with most of history, the people sort of at the bottom of the social hierarchy are going to bear the brunt of imperialism and the negative aspects of it. Now, there are some people, as Strayer aptly pointed out, who found opportunities to move up within the social hierarchy. For example, a new middle class of Western educated elites was created, usually in the wake of imperialism. And those people were not from the traditional elites of their societies, and they tended to benefit from the education and increased social position that they received after imperialism. So there were people who did benefit. Sure also went in to the economics of women and also farmers who began producing cash crops for export. So there were some winners across the system. But it's important to remember that in most cases, Europeans could not rule all of their colonies single-handedly. Strayer gave the really good example of West Africa, French West Africa, where in a huge land area, something like 5 times the size of France, there were under 400 French colonial administrators actually running that area. So they needed local rulers to help them run their huge empires. And in many cases, local rulers sort of used that as an opportunity to gain power and influence for their own families. So there were winners, both among imperialized nations and among the imperializers. Of course, rising tension, competition among Europeans is going to lead to a number of close calls of Europeans nearly going to full-fledged war with one another. There are a couple different issues that take place in Morocco between France and Germany. France and Britain have conflict in southern Sudan over sort of the boundaries of their African empire. So there are going to be a lot of competitive European powers that are at each other's throats during this period, and that tension, that rising tension, and that sense of nationalism is going to help push Europeans as well as other colonial subject peoples to the brink of war in 1914 when World War I breaks out. So, of course, racism. Racism is a huge justification for the imperializing mission, and racism is exacerbated and enhanced by the fact that Europeans, with their industrialized weaponry and powerful economies, are able to go in and so fully dominate many of these areas, despite the fact that there's that sort of constant low-level war and a number of rebellions. Europeans tended to win, and there are some notable exceptions that I'll talk about in just a little bit, but Europeans had so much success and they exhibited so much power that it really sort of enhanced their own favorable notions about themselves and their race. This is an insane statistic. In 1914, at the outbreak of World War I, so will you circle the date 1914 and just write WW Roman numeral 1 out to the side. That's the date of World War I. So at the start of World War I, Europe controlled about 85% of the world's territory, up from about 15%, which they controlled in 1815. So Again, you can see where that racism would begin to increase. That kind of dominance sort of reinforces one's own notions about their superiority. Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands had the biggest empires. I didn't really put Russia into this category because for the most part they're very occupied with creating a traditional land-based empire. However, they will get into the game a little bit later. And again, primarily Russia will be concerned about its land empire. However, it will attempt to exert its authority outside of its territory as well. Germany, as I just mentioned, Italy, who's actually a bit unsuccessful. They're one of the European nations that gets humiliated in battle against Ethiopia, which manages to maintain its independence after a war with Italy. The US and Japan, of course, are also imperialist powers that take a number of colonies, notably for the United States, the Philippines, and notably for Japan, Korea. All right, we're going to look at a bit of a case study here, the Scramble for Africa, which was a huge component of this chapter of Strayer. What you're looking at right there is a South African diamond mine, and that's just to reiterate the idea of exploiting these colonies for economic reasons. So let's talk about change over time first. And I want you to look at a couple of things. I want you to check the date of each. I want you to look at who is shown to be powerful in each of these pictures and how you know. So pause this video so that you can take a look and fill out that little area for observation and comparing and contrasting these two things. So here's the first one. This is a drawing from what is today Uganda, and this is a monarch of Africa leafing through a Bible which was given to him by the guests. So here's the African king. Here are the European British explorers, who of course were attempting to spread religion. This is 1862, so this is very late. This is during the American Civil War. It says down below, European travelers, explorers, and missionaries were often the forerunners of colonization. European governments sometimes justified colonial conquest and occupation by citing the need to protect their citizens who are living or traveling in an African or Asian land. What conclusions might be drawn about the power relationships between the people shown? Okay, and that's the important part, that question right at the end. So, take a moment, pause the video, jot down some observations, or just take a good look at the picture. And then I want you to compare it with this one. This is in West Africa, where a very significant attempt at preventing British control from occurring took place. This is 1896. And not only is the ruler, the king, formally submitting, but also his mother is making a submission to the British people. You can see that they've created like an impromptu platform. It's just, biscuits, like cookies to have with your tea. Okay. So I want you to kind of compare and contrast those two pictures. I hope what is obvious to you as you look at them is the position of importance. The person on the raised dais, in this case, is the African king, and in this case is a European military officer. And this position, which sort of mirrors the Chinese kowtow that we've already discussed when we talked about the McCartney mission, is a really sort of degrading display, right, of inferiority. So draw your observations. We'll try to chat about these things in class a little bit if we have some time. So let's talk about how we go from pretty much independence throughout Africa in the 1860s to by 1914, basically all of Africa being controlled by Europeans. So the Scramble for Africa. Sorry, there's the definition right there. Okay, there's a line for you to jot in the definition, which is a hurried land grab by Europeans for African lands. And it begins with this thing called the Berlin Conference. I'd like you to draw a little llama out to the side of the Berlin Conference. In 1884 and 1885, Otto von Bismarck called Europeans together to Berlin. And essentially what they did is create rules and drew boundaries that divided up the African continent among themselves. No Africans are present at this event, and Europeans, in an attempt to sort of prevent war amongst themselves, decided to just carve up quickly Africa. And one of the stipulations was that you had to have troops in the area that you were claiming. So, of course, there was a huge rush to sort of fulfill the rules of the game and get as many colonies as was feasible. So you can see this is Africa before the Scramble, and as we've seen in the past, primarily what you're looking at are colonial trading posts. After the Scramble for Africa, it will look, of course, completely different. All right. As a result of this Berlin Conference by 1914, Europeans had conquered everything except for Liberia and Ethiopia, and even Liberia was actually sort of a project of the United States to send former slaves back to Africa. This is where we start to get the term "the sun never sets" on the British Empire. The British at this point owned India, had sphere of influence in China. It had islands all over the globe, and it owned really the most important parts of Africa. And here is Cecil Rhodes. He was the one who made that quote that I had at the beginning of the lecture. And he also had a quote in the Strayer text about how he said the British Empire is a matter of bread and butter. If you want to avoid a civil war, then you must become an imperialist. He basically said Europe has to have Africa in order to send the poor people that we have back home somewhere else to avoid a civil war. So, again, not the most savory of characters. And I want you to note Cecil Rhodes' position on the continent of Africa here. There is a sort of goal of Britain, which was to gain colonies from Cairo to Cape Town. That was sort of the slogan. Cairo being in Egypt and Cape Town being way down here in South Africa. So the goal of Britain was to gain a north-south axis. So you might want to note that out to the side of the sun never sets on the British Empire. You might want to note that Britain's goal was to gain a north to south continuous line of colonies throughout Africa. All right, we've got a couple of sources again. These ones are actually written sources, compare and contrast, and one is a little bit more positive, one is a little bit more negative. Give me more than that in your analysis. I don't want to be like, one says imperialism's good, one says imperialism's bad. Okay, so give me a little bit more analysis than that. Go ahead and just pause the video for as long as you need to in order to get that done. I'd like to note that the top one is from the Belgian Congo, and it is very important to know the product that was taken out of the Belgian Congo, which, as you can see from this primary source, is rubber, and the kids with no hands, their hands were like macheted off. Those kids in the book, that picture, were from the Belgian Congo, and that pretty much, without a doubt, that was where the worst of colonial abuses took place. The Congo Free State was actually the personal domain of King Leopold II of Belgium, and the people were horrifyingly mistreated, and upwards of 1 million people likely lost their lives in this effort to extract rubber. So take a moment, read those, compare them, pause it as long as you need to. All right, let's talk about resistance to this. There was a kind of a sad quote in the Strayer text. It was just a bit depressing. It was from the Vietnamese emperor. Vietnam was taken over by the French. Southeast Asia, in general, was taken over by the Dutch and the French. And the quote in the Strayer text quoted the emperor of Vietnam sort of at the end of their, colonial resistance. And he said, "Do you really wish to confront such a power? It would be like mounting an elephant's head or caressing a tiger's tail." So, I mean, you can imagine, like, trying to pet a tiger on its tail. It's not going to end well. He says, with what you presently have, do you really expect to dissolve the enemy's rifles into air? So, he sees the hopelessness of resisting Europeans. Despite that fact, and despite that some sort of threw in the towel, I think that was one reaction. Some cooperated, especially those people who were gaining that new Western education, although that cooperation will not last long as they start to see the contrast between what Europeans say they value and what they do in these colonies. And then, of course, there's fighting. And there's a lot of fighting. We've seen in the past examples where Europeans' influence was felt and where various areas of the globe attempted to resist. The Tanzimat reforms of the Ottoman Empire is an example of that. Muhammad Ali's attempts to modernize Egypt is an example of that. The Taiping Rebellion, which was sort of an anti-Qing rebellion, but especially the later Boxer Rebellion, which was more overtly anti-foreign, were definite examples of colonial resistance. The Meiji Restoration, where Japan industrializes and sort of wholesale adopts all of those techniques that Europeans were using to dominate for itself, are great examples of colonial resistance. But there's also military engagement. And I'd like to focus on Ethiopia just for a little bit. This is toward the end of the Scramble for Africa, just about 10 years out from World War I. And an Italian army was actually defeated at the Battle of Adawa, and Ethiopians are going to like celebrate this event for forever, and Italians are going to feel humiliated by this event for forever. And Italians will actually go back and take Ethiopia right before World War II begins, because they just can't live it down. They like have to go and attempt to conquer Ethiopia again because they were so ashamed of being defeated. And this is just a great example of a ruler in Africa who had a centralized state already, who was able to sort of co-opt the military techniques of Europeans and then use them against Europeans. The other one I'd like you to write out to the side is Islawanda, which is in South Africa. Just note that the British suffered a defeat to the Zulu. So, and that's sufficient, even if you can't remember the name of the battle. Just the British suffering a defeat against the Zulu of South Africa. And we'll discuss those hopefully a little bit in class, but they're just really nice examples of Europeans not always gaining the full upper hand, even though they had all of this awesome industrialized military equipment. Sometimes, whether it was terrain or organization or co-opting the techniques, sometimes they just could not win so far from home against these people that they were attempting to colonize. All right. Once control had been established, there were a few ways that a colony could be ruled. One was called direct rule. This was used mostly by France, and I'd like you to put a star beside direct and indirect rule. These are two terms that you've got to know. They will show up on the time period 5 test, as will that bolded term extraterritoriality, which we'll get to in just a second. Direct rule, again, is used mostly by France, and the goal is to have Europeans running the show rather than local elites. The goal was to intentionally weaken native political institutions and hopefully to assimilate those populations into the dominant colonial colonizers' culture. So they're going to use intentionally some methods to sort of foster discord, using boundaries that cut across ethnic lines, for example, to like sort of weaken the ability of various people groups to resist this direct rule. Indirect rule will be used mostly by Britain, and long term. Colonies that were ruled using indirect rule, for example, India in most estimations is indirectly ruled. And long term, these types of colonies are going to gain more experience with self government, and after decolonization occurs, they will be better off. For the most part, this is sort of like the collaboration idea. Britain would go out, they would look for local elites who were willing to work with them in order to either retain or gain power, and they would work with those indigenous rulers to control their various colonies. An important thing to note is that Europeans were not, in either the direct rule or the indirect rule circumstance, subject to the laws of any of these colonies. They were always tried back home, like say somebody was caught murdering a person in a colony and they were a European. They would be sent home to be tried in the nation's home courts, and almost certainly they would be absolved and found innocent in that court of law. This allowed foreigners to feel above the law because they literally were exempt from the local laws of the areas where they were living. All right. I think there's a huge amount of information to really unpack in this chapter. Strayer talked extensively about the way that race and segregation played out in colonies where there were a lot of white settlers. There was a pretty extensive discussion of South Africa and how that nation moved to complete segregation, which they called apartheid, for example. There was a good discussion about religion and the amount of Christianization that took place, especially in Africa. It noted that about 50% of the non-Muslim population of sub-Saharan Africa was actually converted during this period of imperialism. And there was a lot of discussion about the economics of the system in terms of wage labor, forced labor, as with the cultivation system in Indonesia and those sorts of things. So feel free to go back and look through Strayer's discussion of these things. I thought this chapter did a really nice job of covering all those issues, and because of our short time with all the snow days, just be aware that reading closely is more important than ever. Come to class with your questions, and I'll leave you guys with this map of Africa after the Scramble for Africa. And I hope that you can see pretty much you've got Ethiopia as an independent nation, and that's about it. You can see from Cairo up here in Egypt down to Cape Town down here in Africa, Britain almost fulfilled its goal of having one continuous north to south empire. And this is going to vastly shape the 20th century and into the 21st. Most of the issues that will be dealt with in the next century really have their roots in this time period of history. So again, come with questions, and make sure that you've got some good analysis down for issues like these primary sources and the pictures and stuff.